I am not a historian, but neither are you. So, how about we, the people, learn this stuff together? Welcome to US 101. And I apologize for not having done this episode a few weeks ago following the hurricane that hit Puerto Rico. My bad. That I should have done this earlier. The devastation that has rained down on Puerto Rico thanks to Hurricane Maria has now put the island and its 3.4 million residents into the spotlight. The death toll in Puerto Rico because of the hurricane now sits at a little above 40, which I guess isn't really all that bad. I mean, according to the president.
Every death is a horror. But if you look at a real catastrophe like Katrina, and you look at the tremendous hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people that died. Now, what is your death count as of this moment? 17?
16 certified.
16 people certified. 16 people versus in the thousands.
Sure, Mr. President, I completely understand. This isn't a real catastrophe at all. It's just a place that has no electricity, no clean water to drink, and according to one of your tweets, is a place that relief workers from FEMA and the military can't stay for very long. But I mean, I guess that makes sense, right? I mean, it's not like Puerto Ricans are American citizens, right? Like the ones that were hit by hurricanes in Texas and in Florida, and in the case of Hurricane Katrina, the American citizens in Louisiana, so... Sorry, hang on one second. Don't know why someone calling me. Hello. Puerto Ricans are American citizens? Puerto Rico is an American territory? How did you even know I was talking about that? Why are you watching me? Now, for context, because as we all know, context is key, prior to the United States landing on Puerto Rican shores, Puerto Rico was actually a colony of Spain for many centuries. But in February of 1898, Puerto Rico was aiming for sovereignty, and they did this by forming their own independent government, even though they were a colony of Spain. And by forming that independent government, they had their own charter. They established voting rights among their people. Towns in Puerto Rico could form their own decisions regarding town matters without having to consult the larger government. It seemed as if Puerto Rico was slowly on its way to becoming its own independent nation. And then a ship blew up in Cuba. On February 15, 1898, in a harbor in Cuba, an American battleship known as the USS Maine, which was carrying around about 350 to 400 American crew members, exploded and sank. Now, the reason the Maine was even in Cuba, just so you guys know, was that at the time, Cuba was also trying to rise up against Spain and become its own independent nation, and there were quite a few rioters roaming the streets of Havana, Cuba, and the Maine was there to primarily protect American citizens that were in Cuba at the time. They didn't want them to get hurt or anything by any of the rising violence that was occurring. But because the Maine exploded and sank, it took with it 200 American lives. And American citizens, as well as Congress, immediately thought that this was the work of Spain. They thought Spain blew up the ship. And the reason that a lot of Americans thought that Spain blew up the ship was because a lot of American press outlets began reporting that Spain blew up the Maine using a torpedo or a mine. But those stories were all it took for American citizens to begin crying out as a battle cry, "Remember the Maine! This explosion! They blew up the ship! There must be revenge!" Except there's one problem with that story. In 1976, a group of American naval investigators looked into the explosion of the Maine, and they concluded that the ship was not blown up by a mine or a torpedo. It wasn't blown up by Spain at all. In fact, the ship, there was a fire on the ship. The fire got to the ship's ammunition stocks, and the ammunition exploded. So Spain never blew up the ship. It blew itself up. But again, that didn't matter, man. At the time, all this sensationalist journalism, or what would later become known as yellow journalism, was pushing the narrative over and over again. Spain did this, we have to get our revenge, it's their fault, we have to strike back. And so the United States, in order to sort of antagonize Spain and get on their bad side, they started siding with the Cuban rebels. They started saying that Cuba should have independence and Spain should back off. And Spain did not like that response. So on April 24, 1898, Spain declared war on the United States, and the very next day, the U.S. went game on. And what would later become known as the Spanish-American War kicked off. But the thing is this war was not a very long one. It only took about 3 months or so for the Americans to defeat Spain. In fact, some of the American soldiers that went down into Cuba to fight Spanish forces included Teddy Roosevelt and his Rough Riders. But Cuba was not the only place that American forces would engage the Spanish. The Americans also went to other Spanish-held territories, including, you guessed it, Puerto Rico. The American forces landed on Puerto Rico and they convinced Puerto Rican citizens to help them fight the Spanish. And in return, the Americans said that we will help you achieve life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, and pursuit of property. Does that sound familiar to you? So the Puerto Ricans were like, yeah, cool, we're down, man. Anything that you guys can help us do to achieve our own independence and for us to become our own independent nation, we're in. So the Puerto Ricans helped the United States fight Spain in the war. The war was officially marked as over in December of 1898 with the signing of the Treaty of Paris, to which Spain agreed to the following items. First, Spain said, okay, fine, we're going to back off of Cuba. Fine, go ahead. They can do their own thing. We're going to leave them alone. Secondly, Spain transferred its sovereignty over the Philippines to the United States for a tidy sum of $20 million. In essence, the United States bought the Philippines from Spain for $20 million. And thirdly, the United States gained control of Spanish colonial territories, including Guam and Puerto Rico. Not a bad haul, America. So now that America had Puerto Rico in its pocket, did it let the citizens of Puerto Rico go on to establish that independent nation that they wanted so desperately? Not quite. Puerto Rico became known as an unincorporated territory, which, unlike an incorporated territory, meant that it could not become a state anytime soon. It was just property of the United States now. Furthermore, and this fact is actually quite disturbing, but it is 100% true, guys. In 1901, there were a series of legal opinions that came out that were known as the insular cases, which argued that Puerto Rico could not become a part of the Union, an official state, because it was filled with, quote, alien races, end quote, that didn't understand, quote, Anglo-Saxon principles, end quote. In essence, basically saying Puerto Rico is not full of white people, therefore we're not going to let them into the United States. We're not going to make them a state, part of the Union, because they wouldn't get, how could these lesser beings know how to run a state? It doesn't make sense. And so Puerto Ricans were just kind of held in limbo. They weren't a state, they weren't independent, they were just there, and they were owned by the United States, in essence, for a long time, until 1917, when President Woodrow Wilson looked into his heart and said, you know what? These people need to become citizens of the United States. They need to become one of it. We need to embrace them into the warm bosom of the United States. And so in 1917, he signed the Jones-Shafroth Act, which granted Puerto Ricans citizenship. Not bad, right? Until you remember that 1917 was also the year that the United States entered World War I. So why not give Puerto Rican citizenship so that we can bolster our armed forces? But hey, I mean, they're citizens now, right? Which means Puerto Ricans are now privy to all the rights and privileges of all other American citizens living on the continental United States, Alaska, and Hawaii. You thought that something would go easy for Puerto Rico? Have you been listening to this story? Puerto Ricans are American citizens, except for the fact that they cannot vote for the President of the United States, nor can they vote for members of the House of Representatives or the Senate. What they do get to vote for, though, is what's called a resident commissioner of Puerto Rico, which means one person from Puerto Rico gets to go to the House of Representatives, have their voice heard when it comes to certain bits of legislation, but when it comes time to vote on that legislation, they don't get a vote. They just sit back and say, well, I put up a good argument. Maybe they'll listen. So my guess is by now some of you are probably thinking, okay, it's not 1917 anymore. It's not the 1950s, 1960s. It's 2017. Why doesn't Puerto Rico just become a state? Clearly, we're not thinking about them as alien races anymore, so why don't they just become a state and let's be done with it? And that's a fine thought for you to have, because in fact, Puerto Ricans have been thinking about statehood for quite a while now. In fact, earlier this year, just a few months ago, residents of Puerto Rico overwhelmingly voted yes on a referendum for statehood. And by overwhelmingly, I mean about over 90%. But the problem with that, though, is that only about 20% or so of the island came out to actually vote for that. So 20% of Puerto Ricans overwhelmingly want statehood. The other 80% didn't even go to vote because they just didn't give a shit. And also, here's the thing. Even though they voted on a referendum and they said, yes, we want to be a state, voting on a referendum doesn't really mean much other than it's kind of like you raising your hand in class and going, oh, I want to do this. It's acknowledgement. But at the end of the day, for Puerto Rico to become a state, that decision comes down to Congress. But as I mentioned earlier, guys, Puerto Rico has no vote in Congress. They only have the resident commissioner that can sit in Congress and go, oh yes, we'd very much like to be a state. That would be wonderful. But that's as far as their influence will go. They don't get to vote on legislation involving Puerto Rico. But the main thing that I wanted you guys to grasp from this episode is that Puerto Ricans are American citizens. And American citizens are in trouble in Puerto Rico, and we can help our fellow American citizens. So I'm asking you guys if you could do me a favor and just click the links down below in the description box. Those links will take you to globalgiving.org and hispanicfederation.org/unidos. You can click those links and you can donate money to help out Puerto Ricans that are still suffering from the devastation that came with Hurricane Maria. And that is it for this episode, guys. Thank you so much for hanging out with me today. Really do appreciate it. And as always, thank you so much to those of you that have subscribed to the channel, for liking the videos, watching them, sharing them, and leaving comments in the comment section down below. Your engagement in these videos, guys, is the best part of this damn job. As always, guys, you can follow US 101 on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, all those links down below in the description box. Guys, I will see you next Tuesday for an all-new episode of US 101. Until then, I am all done. Say it with me. Puerto Rico!